Guys, welcome back. This is Coach Rutland. We're going to be looking at chapter 23 today, the last chapter in our book, talking about Reconstruction's impact on the nation. Okay, so we're finally finishing up chapter 23 here, last chapter in the book, and going to look at how Reconstruction plays out, especially in the South. So we are looking at our last four standards today. 8.72, 8.73, 8.74, and 8.75. Again, all dealing with Reconstruction. So 8.72, going through them really quickly. 8.72 says, explain the restrictions placed on the rights and opportunities of freedmen, including racial segregation, black codes, and the efforts of the Freedmen's Bureau to address the problems confronting newly freed slaves. 8.73 talks about the trace, or we're going to be able to trace the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and vigilante justice in the South and in Tennessee, including the role of Governor William Brownlow. 8.74, we're going to explain the roles of carpetbaggers and scallywags played during Reconstruction. And last, 8.75, we're going to explain the Compromise of 1877 and its role in ending radical Reconstruction. So those are the four standards we're going to be looking at through chapter 23 and throughout this video. Now, some objectives we're going to try to hopefully accomplish in this video. First, we should be able to explain the restrictions placed on the rights and opportunities of freedmen. We should be able to explain how racial segregation was used to restrict the rights and opportunities of freedmen. And we should be able to explain the efforts of the Freedmen's Bureau to address the problems confronting newly freed slaves. We'll be able to trace the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and vigilante justice in the South and in Tennessee. We'll be able to identify the role of Governor William Brownlow in the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and vigilante justice in the South and in Tennessee. We'll be able to explain the roles of carpetbaggers and scallywags played during Reconstruction. And finally, we'll be able to explain the Compromise of 1877 and its role in ending radical Reconstruction. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau on March 3rd of 1865 to help the 4 million freed slaves transition into freedom. So this was an entire agency that was devoted to help free slaves. The Freedmen's Bureau was supposed to be a temporary agency, only lasting a year, but it lasted actually about 7 years until 1872. So what did the Freedmen's Bureau do? It does several things for freed slaves. First, it provides basic welfare services and health care. It fed millions of people. The agency also helped former slaves find jobs, legalize marriages, and locate lost relatives. Two of the more main important things the Freedmen's Bureau did is it built teacher training institutions and more than 1,000 schools for former slaves. It also helped create historically black colleges and universities, also known as HBCUs, such as Howard University and Fisk University in Nashville. Now, one thing we have to look at as well is the farming in the South. So the Civil War ruined the South's land and destroyed its slave-based economic system. Because a lot of the fighting from the Civil War happened in the South, the land was kind of torn up, especially in Georgia with Sherman's March to the Sea. And of course, their farming system was based on slave labor. So with no more slaves, the South had to figure out a new way to farm. So with slavery abolished, with slavery abolished, landowners needed people to work their land, and newly freed slaves need jobs. Again, these are slaves that really have only done one job in their life, and that is farm. So they kind of go back to what they're used to. So many freed slaves become tenant farmers or sharecroppers on their old owners' land. And we'll get into tenant farmers and sharecroppers right here. Okay, so in these arrangements, landowners rented land, and the farmers, or the tenant farmers, or the sharecroppers, would give the landowner a percentage of their crops as rent. So the difference between tenant farmers and sharecroppers. Tenant farmers owned animals, equipment, supplies, and received about 75% of their harvest. Okay, the other 25% again is going to the actual landowner as rent. Sharecroppers, on the other hand, didn't own anything. They just contributed their labor to the land. Okay, so sharecroppers received about 50% of the harvest. The other 50% would be for rent for the land, and then even more was taken out for animals, equipments, and supplies. So it was very hard to get ahead, not only for sharecroppers, but for tenant farmers as well. Okay, so they basically had to figure out a whole new system of farming in the South. That comes in the form of tenant farmers and sharecroppers. Now, of course, the South also gets some aid from the North in kind of this rebuilding process. So not only did Southerners want to rebuild the South, but Northerners also wanted to rebuild it as well. Again, we do have a lot of Northern textile companies that were dependent on Southern cotton, so they want to see them get back to their prominence of cotton growing. So some wealthy Northerners invested in Southern farming, and others actually went and lived in the South to hopefully take advantage of the chaos in the economy and politics. Okay, so some were just kind of investing money, giving the South money, while others were actually going to live there and hopefully try to kind of take advantage and make a lot of money in that kind of now destroyed economy, or getting into politics where maybe they didn't have the support in the North. So other Northerners also came to support Reconstruction and bring about change in Southern politics. These are the people that you're trying to see get free African Americans more rights, and not really let them fall back into a slave-like condition. So these Northerners who moved to the South were known as carpetbaggers. This political cartoon here to the right kind of shows one of those. They were called carpetbaggers by Southerners just because of the suitcases that were made from carpet material. Okay, so that was apparently the thing back in the day, and they were known as carpetbaggers. Scallywags, on the other hand, were Southerners who welcomed in these Northerners, or these carpetbaggers, into the South and supported their ideas. Scallywags in the South were basically seen as traitors. They were basically giving up that Southern way of life to these Northerners, so they were seen as traitors and known as scallywags. Now, there were some Southern responses to Reconstruction. One of the major ones is in 1866, when 6 Confederate veterans formed the Ku Klux Klan in Pulaski, Tennessee. In 1867, the KKK began terrorizing and killing former slaves in order to keep whites in power. Okay, so I think most of us are familiar with the KKK, a racist group who would attack these former slaves in order to keep that white superiority, in Southern culture. Governor William Brownlow, though, of Tennessee, created a militia of 1,600 troops to stop the KKK. And we do see the KKK kind of disband around 1869. So with Southern states also using poll taxes and literacy tests to keep freed slaves from voting. Congress passes the 15th Amendment in 1870. We talked about that in chapter 22, where people could not be kept from voting because of their race, color, or former being a former slave. This still didn't stop people from keeping African Americans from voting. To your right there on the screen is an actual literacy test that was given to African Americans to keep them from voting. Okay, so they're very, very kind of difficult, very confusing, and they could easily be manipulated to keep African Americans from voting. Okay, so that was some of the Southern responses to Reconstruction. And finally, we get to the end of Reconstruction. By the 1870s, support for radical Reconstruction had began to fade. People weren't really happy with it. They were kind of tired of it. So in 1876, the presidential election came down to 3 disputed states: Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. These were the last 3 states to still have military troops in them from radical Reconstruction. So, with this disputed election, Congress creates an electoral commission to determine the winner of the 1876 presidential election between Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes, who is pictured here to the right. What this commission comes to basically agree on is that the Democrats, who are mainly Southerners, agreed to Hayes, who is a Republican, becoming president if the Republicans pulled out the troops of the last 3 states. The Republicans agree, and this becomes known as the Compromise of 1877. Okay, so finally Democrats, which again the South will primarily be Democrat up until the 1900s, they are able to kind of take back control of the South and get the Republicans out of the South and back into the North. So with the Compromise of 1877, this basically ends Reconstruction in the South. All right, so looking back again at our objectives, we again have explained the restrictions placed on the rights and opportunities of freedmen. We have explained how racial segregation was used to restrict the rights and opportunities of freedmen. We've explained the efforts of the Freedmen's Bureau to address the problems confronting newly freed slaves. We trace the rise of the KKK and vigilante justice in the South and in Tennessee. We identified the role of Governor William Brownlow in the rise of the KKK and vigilante justice in the South and in Tennessee. We explained the roles of carpetbaggers and scallywags and the roles they played during Reconstruction. And we explained how the Compromise of 1877, and we explained its role in ending radical Reconstruction. Okay, so that gets us through Reconstruction, gets us through chapter 23 and the end of the book. Okay, so hope you enjoyed, and we'll see y'all next time.